Today, I'm back on the channel to bring you even more of my trading tips for Dynasty Fantasy Football. But before I get into it, make sure you leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Comment down below some of your trading tips in Dynasty Fantasy Football as well. But with all that said, let's get right into it. Tip number one, do not ever send a straight up trade offer, a 1-for-1 trade at the same position. That being said, you should also never accept a straight up 1-for-1 trade at the same position that you're offered. For an example, the other day I was offered a Saquon Barkley straight up for my J.K. Dobbins. By sending that trade to me, you're essentially telling me that J.K. Dobbins is more valuable to you than Saquon Barkley. What am I going to do with that information? I'm going to take that and get as much more value out of that deal as I can, since you literally just told me that he's more valuable. There's no real legitimate argument when it comes to wide receiver this guy versus wide receiver this guy being more or less valuable, or this guy's better in a rebuild, this guy's better in a competing team, whatever the case is. Value doesn't really equate that way. If somebody's sending you a trade 1-for-1 for wide receiver A to wide receiver B, make sure you're getting as much value out of that as possible and getting more on top of that wide receiver. Because like I said, they just told you that to them, that player is more valuable. So make sure you get as much as you can out of that offer. For example, when it came to my deal of J.K. Dobbins for Saquon Barkley, I ended up getting an additional second and third round pick in 2023 out of that sender. The next tip I have for you today is to never accept the first trade offer you receive. More often than not, and this is something you should take into regard for your own offer trades, is that when people are sending a trade, they're more often than not setting up a middle ground of where they would actually accept an offer. But before they get to that point, they want to be at a point closer to what they would really love to get. You don't want to cut yourself short. You want to make sure you find that middle ground closer to what would actually be really good for you. And this kind of goes back to the trade before. Granted, not all offers are going to be 1-for-1 positional trades, but say I did just prefer Saquon to J.K. Dobbins and I would have taken that trade, I would have missed out on a second and a third round pick in what's supposed to be the best draft class ever. Even if you really like the deal, don't be afraid to counter back to, say, improve a third round pick to a second round pick, add an additional third round pick. Whatever you can do to add more ammo into that trade of what you're getting to improve value for you, even if you like the offer where it stands when it comes in, never hit send right away, because I guarantee you're probably leaving value on the table. Don't pre-plan trades. Now, what the heck does that mean, Bob? It gets real easy to get caught up in kind of the grand scheme of things when you're building a dynasty roster. Oh, I could move this guy for that guy. I could move this guy for that guy. Don't do that. Work with the roster you have, moving one piece at a time, maybe a couple pieces at a time. Don't get too crazy. Don't, especially when you're not necessarily in a rebuild. If you're just straight up trying to compete right now, don't make this trade and make yourself weaker here, assuming you can make trade number 2 to improve that position later. Because more often than not, that trade just doesn't necessarily happen, and you're going to work yourself into a hole trying to fill that spot later. Whereas if you just stuck with trade number 1, not damaging your other positions on your team or whatever the case is, you would have found yourself in a better spot going forward than if you did manage to get trade number 1 done, but you weren't able to get trade number 2 done to fix that hole you left with trade number 1. That is a great way to just kind of get yourself into a hole that you might not get out of. One thing that I just honestly hate as a content creator or as just somebody who plays Dynasty in general, I hate overload trades. These are trades that could be where you're sending 5 to 10 plus assets that are actually decent assets, second round picks, first round picks, decent players in the mix, whatever the case is, for just like 2 or 3 players tops, or even just one player. Doing trades like that and just destroying all of your assets is a great way to get yourself into a pit of dynasty despair that you'll never get out of, because once you put and sink so many assets into one player, you need that player to meet and exceed expectations that probably just isn't going to happen, quite frankly. For example, I actually pulled up a YouTube comment here. Someone offered 3 2022 first rounders, 1 second round pick, a 4th round and a 5th round pick, meh on those, Jared Goff and Carson Wentz for Justin Herbert, and thankfully it got rejected. I get that Justin Herbert is an awesome piece to have in Dynasty, and he's definitely better than those 2 quarterbacks. But when it comes to 3 2022 first rounders and even a second round pick, the gap there is just too much. Like, I'm glad for this guy that this trade didn't happen to go through. Just because you really want to get a guy in your roster, there are times where the price is just too high, where it's just not worth it. It's just not going to pay off for you. If that trade would have gone through and Justin Herbert would have ended up on his team, Justin Herbert versus the other 2 quarterbacks, especially this year, Jared Goff has a ton of weapons. I think super slept on quarterback, but besides the point, long term, Justin Herbert would never make up the value of what 3 first-round picks could do, even in this weaker class, even if they end up being 3 of the top wide receivers that aren't even in the top 5. I just don't see that value ever equating. One of my favorite tips, and possibly the most important tip I have for you today, is that just because you have an abundance of assets, whether it be players, picks, that does not make those assets any less valuable. So just because you have 5 2022 first-round picks or 2023 first-round picks, that doesn't mean you go send 3 of them for a Justin Herbert. You need to treat every asset like it still matters and like it could help your team at some point. Because if you do that, you're actually going to build a monster of a roster at some point. I know at some point you have to cut guys. You can't have, 50 players on your rosters unless you're in awesome dynasty leagues that probably roster too many people, but that is the quickest way. It's so hard to get assets on your team, especially when it comes to like draft capital. Why would you just want to give it away like that? That is a great way to start losing trades down the road. You shouldn't be trying to win trades, but you also shouldn't be trying to lose them either. The next tip I have for you today is how to sell players when nobody's buying them. This is probably one of the toughest things to do in Dynasty Fantasy Football. The news comes out, Washington Commanders just drafted Brian Robinson. Crap, what am I doing with my Antonio Gibson shares? Ideally, you would have sold him 3-4 weeks before the draft. It happens. The fact of the matter is, when you probably should have been getting a first-round pick plus originally for Antonio Gibson, a lot of people were still on the Antonio Gibson train of, hey, this guy is a dude who has all the potential in the world. He can do this, he can do that. We just haven't seen it yet. That kind of Terry McLaurin, that DJ Moore type vibe where he's definitely has the potential. I'm not even going to say that he doesn't. But before that draft pick was made, you probably could have gotten a first round pick plus for Antonio Gibson, maybe a little more. Some people pretty crazy for Antonio Gibson. I'm not going to get into that today. So when a player's stock down like that, how do you move those guys? Well, you need to realize you're not going to get the value like I mentioned. What you try to do instead is try to chip away at lesser quality pieces that you're ending up with more quantity of to try to equate that quality later. So instead of snagging, say, a first round pick and a early second round pick, now you're trying to snag 2 second round picks and a third round pick in ideally next year's class in 2023. It's a lot easier, especially for teams to move on from draft capital that isn't so high. Even say that pick ends up being the 201 versus the 112, just hypothetically, the value stipulation there, just in somebody's head, the stigma there is just wildly different. It shouldn't be. It definitely shouldn't be, but it's one of those things that it could be and that it probably is. That was a lot of words. And another thing is, it's a lot easier to kind of stack years out as opposed to getting picks in the same year. So maybe you're getting a 23 second, a 24 third, and maybe another 24 second. That's another way to kind of shift the value perception on the pieces you're getting. It equates similar to what you were getting originally for Antonio Gibson. The people who are doing the mental backflips to say that, just for example, Antonio Gibson is still in a great spot. He's fine, whatever, Those are going to be the people that see that as an absolute steal. And you'll probably be able to move him pretty quickly. Then what you do with those second round picks, you use those to move up your first round picks and move up other picks. You can sometimes go 2 second round picks to somebody who doesn't have them. Maybe has a mid back into the first round pick. You can trade for that pick, send those 2 for that one. Not something I love to do, but it is a way to still accrue value. And it could be used as a bridge piece to bridge the gap from one player to another player who's just a little better. Either way, you're acquiring more assets to hopefully equate similar value and get out on a player that you want to get out on that nobody's really buying. The last tip I have for y'all today is the best type of trades to make when you're rebuilding. And this goes back to my golden rule of trading. You always want to get more assets in return than the ones you're sending. You're sending 1 piece, you should get 2 back. You're sending 2 pieces, you should get 3 or 4 back, so on and so forth. What this does, it eventually creates that abundance of assets that I was talking about earlier that you shouldn't discredit the value of. That'll hopefully give you enough rounds in the chamber to build your team around a core group of players. Some players you draft in the second round might outplay the players that you draft in the first round. That's why it's important to always have second and third round picks. When we get into fourth and fifth round picks, it's usually a lot of dart throws, but they're there for a reason. So I totally lied when I said that was the last tip I had for you today. Sorry, I hope we can still be friends. On top of the previous tip, the best trades to make when you're building, the best type of trades are the best players to trade when you're rebuilding, or knowing when to trade certain players. We all have a pretty good gauge of how long a certain player or position group is going to be valuable for. Running backs a lot of the time kind of, see the edge at age 26 or 27. Wide receivers, 29, 30. Quarterbacks, God knows, they could play forever. Certain tight ends seem to stick around in the league too for almost forever, it seems. But I'd say generally for tight ends, the peak is probably 31, 32. And then you find a rare gem here and there that can play past that. But so what you do with each player is you basically kind of gauge how long that player is going to be valuable for you in terms of production and things like that. And if you're in that rebuild, it's going to take about a year or 2 to really get to a point where you want to be, where you can compete and things like that. So say that's that's 2 years out. If your wide receiver is 27, 28, it's time to sell that player. If your running back is 25 or 26, it's time to sell that player for what you can right now. When it comes to quarterbacks, probably when you're over the age of 33, 34, probably time to sell that guy, especially if there's pretty decent value around him. Tight ends, I'd probably want to sell around that 28 to 29 age range, because what you want to do is you want to transition into picks, assets, players that are going to be viable for throughout the term of your rebuild. And then for a pretty significant time after. You don't want to trade for guys that are going to be in the prime when you're done with your rebuild. You want to be trading for guys or assets or picks that when you're done with your rebuild, you're hopefully good to go for a long time. And then you can just kind of keep accruing assets and assets and assets with the large abundance you picked up. And I'm still not done. The last bit I have for you today, if you're going to go draft capital hunting, the 2023, the 2024, the 2025 picks that you can get now in Sleeper, they're as cheap as they're ever going to be today. So if you're going to try to get into those draft classes, you may as well start now. Don't be the guy the day before the draft trying to knock on the door for draft capital, because guess what? You're going to get taken for a ride when it comes to value. And until those draft picks are made in those drafts, the value is only going to rise and rise and rise. So while that is it for this one today, I promise this time. I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your favorite trade strategies, what one you heard today that you really enjoyed, that you'll find helpful going forward. And maybe just kidding, I do have one more trade tip for you. Be sure to check out this video on the channel, 10 more trading tips that I did a while back. Never lose another trade again. Always win the trade without trying to win the trade. But hey, with all that said, that is actually it for me today. I will see y'all in the next one. But until then, y'all have a good one.